Okay, so welcome on back. Now, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about strategy and how we come up with strategies for the future by distilling the big picture. Okay, we all see a lot of events going on around the world, but the question is, how do those translate into different activities or different behaviors for us and our organization? So let's spend a little bit of time talking about this. Now, look, if I think about the optimal value proposition and how it is that the marketer creates the optimal value proposition, as I've talked about, for a marketer, they usually start out looking at customers, competitors, collaborators, and the company, but that this is all housed within a context, right? As that what's happening in that great big world out there has an impact. Now, as I said, we then take the customers, we break them into segments, we choose targets where we have a competitive advantage versus our competitors. Once we choose our targets, we begin to position the organization by manipulating the products that we make, the prices that we charge, the places that we make it available, and how we promote our goods and services. Okay, now what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of concentrate on that top box up there. Okay, context. Now, usually when I ask people, I say, what is going to make your firm successful? Most people will go around the room and start giving me answers. And they'll tell me things like, okay, it's going to be human resources. Well, how do human resources make your firm successful? Well, most people will tell me, well, we got to get the best people. But how do you get the best people? Well, sometimes you got to be good at doing what? Well, first of all, I've got to be able to attract people to my organization. Then I've got to be able to select people. Then I've got to be able to develop people, retain people. And some people don't fit with my organization, so I need to be able to dismiss them. So I have to be good at attracting, developing, retaining, dismissing. So good human resources, these are a key to my doing well as an organization. Also, I have to have processes or structures that allow me to get the maximum benefit from those great human resources. Right? Look, if we look at the software industry, for the software industry, one of the keys to their success has always been, do they have a, can they get to market very quickly? The key to success is getting to market quickly. Now, look, they can be good at attracting, developing, retaining, dismissing software engineers. But at the end of the day, how they structure their processes is also going to have a lot to do with getting the maximum out of those human resources. 20 years ago, if firms like Microsoft and all of the software companies started to realize that putting all of their developers up in Redmond, Washington or Portland, Oregon or something like this was not the best thing to do. So what they did is they started to put a group over in Penang, Malaysia, or someplace like Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. And then what they would do is late in the day, after 8 or 10 hours, they would beam over the code. Then they would beam the code from Penang to Limerick, Ireland. They would work on it for another 8 or 10 hours in Limerick, and then they would beam it back to Washington. And when the people were coming into Washington, the code had been worked on for 20 hours. Right? So what they were doing is turning development time into real time and beyond. Right? With the overlaps of the teams and what have you, they were turning a 24-hour day into a 30-hour development day. Well, this is using and having great human resources, but also having structures that allow you to get the maximum out of it. Other people will tell me what's going to make their firm successful is things like new products, those that help you to enter new markets, those that the marketplace wants, those that are better than their competitors, et cetera, et cetera. Other people are going to tell me, oh, it's about cost control, that I need to keep my costs down, that I have to understand my costs. So people will talk about things such as, activity-based costing, time-based costing, all these different ways in which I can cost my performance or cost the activities that I am engaged in that help me to understand the true cost of what it is that I'm doing. Other people will tell me, hey, look, if we're going to win, we got to have good capital management. We have to have steady capital. We have to have low-cost capital. We have to have cash flow management. We need enlightened capital, smart investors. We need, right? All of these kind of things are going to come up. And again, these are very, very important for a firm to be able to succeed. And most of the time, people will also tell me we need good vision. We're going to have a strategy that is succinct, well articulated, easy to communicate. And all of these things on this list, the human resources, the new products, the cost control, capital management. You could tell me about information systems. You could tell me about our customer service. And you could pick out all of these different things. But what do all of these have in common? Well, these are what I call managerial performance. Okay? But there's two other things that are important in the performance of your firm. Managerial performance is all the things that were back here on this last slide. Okay? On the other hand, we also have to keep in mind the industry structure. Who do I compete against and how do they choose to compete? Okay, who I'm competing against has an awful lot to do with how well I'm going to perform. Look, if you're in an industry with very few competitors and those competitors are, quite frankly, not very good, you can be not very good and you'll probably do fairly well. On the other hand, you can be very good at your business. But if you face 200 or 300 competitors that are all quite good and well adjusted to the market, you might find it slow going, even though you've done a very good job of managing. So managerial performance is important, but who you compete against, how they choose to compete, how efficient, how effective, how they perform, that also affects how you do. But the last one here, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is the macro environment. How does the macro environment affect your performance as an organization? And often what happens in this circle is what will define you as an organization. Now, look, just very, very simply, most people talk about what they call pest analysis, what's happening politically, economically, socially, technically. Now, I expand that just a little bit. I like to look at things like the economy. I do look at politics and law. I look at things like the demography of a country, social and cultural issues, physical infrastructure, and technology. Because when I'm developing strategies, all of these things are quite important. Look, if we think about the economy, if the economy is up, we do very well. When the economy is down, we don't do so well. Right? So the economy and being able to predict the ups and downs or the dips and the rises in the economy are quite important to how we're going to do as an organization. Secondly, I have to keep my eye on politics and law. Quite often, the legal environment, nothing changes our performance more than what's happening legally. If I'm in a sin industry, like something like cigarettes or alcohol, right, whatever those tax rates are, that changes how well I perform. When they raise taxes, my consumption tends to go down. Similarly, when they say, well, you can't smoke in public places, you can't smoke in bars, you can't smoke in nightclubs, you can't smoke. Well, all of these things have a tendency to do what? To reduce consumption. So I always have to be looking at what's happening legally. Okay. Similarly, what I need to keep my eye on is what's happening demographically. Look, there are no markets if there are no people. So where are people? What are their ages? What are their incomes? What are their education rates? These are all important things to keep in mind when I'm looking to market my products. Look, if I'm selling computer products and I need a highly computer literate group of people, right, I'm looking on the globe for people with a certain amount of income and a certain amount of technical capacity. Then I'm probably going to be able to sell my computer products. Okay? The fourth one is what's happening socially and culturally. Whatever happens culturally, socially, these tend to have very, very big effects on our performance as an organization. Now, look, if I take these 2, 3, and 4, political, legal, demographic, socio-cultural, I've always been a big believer that these are very, very interlinked. Quite frankly, all 6 of these are interlinked. But if I look at things like social cultural issues, I grew up as a baby boomer in the United States. Now, the baby boom was those people born between 1948 and 1963. Now, the baby boomers, when they got in their teenage years, what were they doing? They were on the streets of America saying, we want drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Okay? Why? Because we were a young country demographically. Those young people want what? They want freedoms. They want rights. They wanted drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Now, what happened? Those people grew up. They became older. And as they became older, what happened? They got a lot more conservative. Instead, this was the same generation of people that wanted drugs, sex, and rock and roll that turned around and started saying, no, 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 no. You shouldn't be able to smoke cigarettes anywhere. We have to have non-smoking zones. Oh, no, wait, we don't need just non-smoking zones. We need non-smoking in public buildings. Oh, wait, we need non-smoking in all restaurants. No, we need non-smoking in... Now you can't even smoke in places like Central Park in America. Okay, so what happened is that group of people that was all about freedoms and rights and what have you, they grew up and they became parents. And when they became parents, they became much more conservative. So look, I don't say this with any good or any bad or any malice or any criticism. It's just, as you look around the globe, you have to recognize young populations generally want a lot of rights, a lot of freedoms. Older populations want security. They want health care. Young populations want education. Old populations want financial security and health care. So when we look around the world, we have to recognize that there's a lot of differences between the demographies, and that demography changes culture, and culture often changes the laws. So that's why I say politics, legal, cultural, demographic, these things are all kind of intertwined. Fifth is physical infrastructure. If you're doing business, you have to keep in mind, what is the physical infrastructure? What can be done in that country? I did some investing and operating of a business in Laos at one point. If you look at a country like Laos, Laos is landlocked, okay, meaning it has no ports or to be able to take things out via transport by the sea. Secondly, there's no railroad. There's no operating railroad in the country. Third, there's no navigable river in the country, so you can't move goods over any kind of water. Now, if we put on top of that just very, very low penetration of roads, you can see that Laos is a hard place to do business. Now, let's take it one step further. In 2010, okay, the penetration of electricity in Laos was about 1 in 119 households. So if I'm looking at a country like Laos, which had at that time about 5.4 million people, okay, and only 1 in 119 households, let's just say 1 in 100 has electricity, that means that my population that's going to be consuming electrical products is only about 55,000 households. Okay, that makes for a very different marketplace than a place like, say, Singapore, where 100% of the population has electricity. More so, 99.3% of the population is internet penetrated. Okay, these are very, very different kinds of environments, right? So these are the kind of things that one has to keep in mind when they are investing. And lastly, technology. Okay, what's happening technology-wise? Anytime there's a shift in technology, we see what? We see changes in the business structure, changes in the business strategies, changes in the way that we enact our models. Sometimes as a marketer, when we see these technological shifts, whether it's things such as the internet, which has now brought customers in contact with us that we could never reach before, whether it's artificial intelligence, where we're able to look at customers' buying behaviors, their search habits, and be able to make better offers to them, or whether we're just able to create an experience that is a better experience by looking at the customer. All of these things are coming out of the technologies. So when I start to think about how to develop a strategy or how to think about my market and what I should be doing in it, I often try to look at these big picture items. So what's happening economically, politically, legally, socially, culturally, technically, and in terms of the physical and infrastructure. So now what I'm going to do is over the next ensuing hour and a half or so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about this, and I'm going to talk first about the economy, then I'm going to talk about demography, and then what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about what I think it's going to mean for things like technology, infrastructure, and the change in the way that we do business. Okay, so that's what we'll be doing over the next hour and a half to 2 hours. Thank you. So look, we're going to take these 6 factors. Now let's take the first one of these, the economy. Now we all know that when the economy is up, we do well. When the economy is down, we don't do so well. But you know, when we start to look at economies, we have to understand our competitors and why competitors can do certain things. Okay, and that is very often unleashed by the type of economy from which they work. Okay, you know, throughout much of my professional career, economy was the one of these 6 factors that really seemed to dominate everything. Today, I think we're moving down towards technology. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little later. We're also looking at laws. They tend to predominate the reasons for competitive advantages and disadvantages. But during my lifetime, the economic structure of a country, okay, which is interlinked with the laws and the demographies and what have you, that tended to be what dominated. Now let me explain why I'm talking about this and what I mean by this. I ran across a gentleman in my the early 1990s named Tasu Shirvani. And what he used to talk about was he talked about the different types of economies. Now, there's 2 basic economies that operate in the world, okay? The first is the supply side economy, and the second is the demand side economy. Now, you could write books and we could read books on the differences between supply side and demand side economies, and the books would be very long and very terse and difficult to read. But at a very superficial, at a very high level, not superficial but high level conceptually, what's the difference between a supply and a demand side economy? And where do we see them? So if I look at the demand side economy, this is what I grew up in the United States. The United States was a demand side economy. And the idea is that if we had demand, all good things would take place. Because what happened was demand led to investment. Investors showed up to meet the needs of a demanding populace. Investment creates jobs. When investment takes place, we have jobs. Jobs create income, and income creates more demand. So this was the theory behind a demand-side economy, is if I had a lot of demand, investors would show up to meet the needs of the demanding populace. They'd see an opportunity in the market. That opportunity and investment created jobs, jobs created income, and income created what? More demand. Right? And this was the theory behind the demand-side economy. Now look, I was in the United States. Our demand-side economy was the greatest the world has ever seen. Okay? I mean, it was the sort of thing that Americans are demanding populace. Okay? The average American spends something in the neighborhood of 99% of their income. So they don't save a lot. They demand. They buy a lot. And buying a lot creates opportunity. Opportunity creates that investment, which creates jobs. Now, how is it that the American consumer consume so much? Why do they buy 99% of their income? Why is it spent? Well, the first thing is in the United States is we allow a lot of advertising. Quite frankly, we allow advertising, and the more people know about goods, the more they tend to buy them. You know, it really wasn't until the marginalists came along in the 1940s before economists began to figure out that it wasn't just income that led to consumption. All of the old economic models used to say the higher income is, the higher consumption is. Well, somewhat. But what we found was with advertising, there was more consumption at every income level. So one of the things we found was the more educated people were on goods and services, the more they wanted them. So if you're going to have a lot of demand, you liberalize your media. You allow a lot of advertising. Secondly is you make credit cheap and easy for people to get. Who? Individuals. You want consumers to consume. So what you want them to do is be able to get debt. You want them to be able to borrow money. Consumer credit is very important in this kind of an economy. Now, we had all kinds of credit cards. We have all kinds of laws that say that consumers need access to credit, and we make it very, very easy for Americans to get debt. Okay, basically, if you have a pulse, you'll be able to get a credit card in the United States. So it's a very, very simple place for people to be able to get debt. The other thing we did is we made debt very, very cheap. Up until the 1980s, the early 1980s, credit card debt and all debt was deductible on your taxes. What did that have the tendency to do? Reduce the cost of that debt. Right? If you could write it off from your taxes, debt didn't cost you as much as it did if you couldn't write it off from your taxes. Okay? And the third thing that we did is we put safeguards in the economy. Okay? Don't save for your retirement. We have Social Security. Don't save for a rainy day. We have unemployment insurance. Don't save and don't worry about your skills. Go out and have a good time and spend your money because we have welfare if you're chronically unemployed. Okay, all of these safety nets have a tendency to do what? To reduce people's willingness to save and enhance their desire to consume. All right, so if I think about the demand side economy, which the US was a fantastic demand side economy, this is the way it tended to work. Okay? All right, now, if I look at the supply side economy, the supply side economy is somewhat similar, but works from a different starting point. The idea in a supply side economy is what? Is savings, not demand. What I want people to do is save their money. Now, the theory behind a supply side economy is that if I have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of savings, what's going to happen to interest rates? Interest rates are going to go down, right? Because we got a big pile of funds. We have more availability of funds. The cost of interest or the cost of acquiring those funds goes down. So the idea behind a savings-based economy or a supply-side economy is lots of savings leads to low interest rates. Now, when interest rates are low, investors invest because capital is very inexpensive. The cost of financing their investment is low, so people will make more investments. More investments creates more jobs creates more income, and more income creates more savings. Okay? So this is the difference in the two types of economies. Savings, interest, investment, jobs, income. The savings-based economy. Okay? All right. Now, the U.S. was the great demand-side economy. Canada was a demand-side economy. Mexico, most of Latin America were demand-side economies. On the other hand, we have supply-side economies, and there have been some great supply-side economies in the world. Germany, Japan, Singapore, Okay, these are the kind of countries that were what we would call supply side economies. Now, if the average American saves a little less than 1% of their income, but the average Singaporean saves about 36% of their income, why is that? Singapore was a fantastically well-developed, still is, a fantastically well-developed supply-side economy. But in a supply-side economy, people need to save. Now, the average Singaporean saves roughly in any year about 36% of their income. The average American saves about 1% of their income. Why do Singaporeans save 36 times what Americans do? Ponder that for a second. Okay. All right, now look, most people are probably saying, well, it's cultural. Nah, it's not culture, okay? Cultures are developed by incentives. Okay, so what's going on here? Why is this? Okay, now one, Singapore has no safeguards in the economy. So if you're going to retire, you have to do it yourself. You have to pay for your retirement. Singapore has no welfare. They have no unemployment. Okay, Singapore is a place that if you wake up and your eyes open, you go to work. Okay, so there is no welfare, there is no social security, there is no unemployment insurance. Singaporeans need to save for that rainy day. Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly is that Singapore, by law, mandates that every Singaporean has to save 27.5% of their income. 12.5% is personal, that is just taken out of your check, and 15% is matched by your company. So 27.5% of your income is saved each and every year. This is why Singaporeans tend to be great savers. Right away, 27.5% of your income is taken out of your check and put away for savings. Okay? Now, over and above that, the average Singaporean saves a little bit less than 10% of their income. Now, there may be something going on in your minds where you're saying, well, maybe it's got to do with taxes. And you're right. Okay, Americans have a lot of taxes. Okay, our top-end federal tax rate, unlike Singapore, which is 19.5%, the federal tax rate in the United States is 34.5% at the top. Then they have 2.75% medical tax. They have a Social Security tax, which is 7.75% of your income, plus another 7.75% if you're self-employed. And then you have state taxes. And in a state like, say, New York State, that might be a 9% state tax and a 2% city tax if you're living in New York City. Well, now you can start to see that those numbers are getting well north of 50%. Makes it very hard for you to be able to save a high proportion of your income in places like the United States. Okay? So what we see is two very, very different economies operating out there. The savings-based economy is very much the supply-side economy, and the idea is we want our people to save a lot of money. But if there's no consumption, where do we get an economy? I mean, where is business going to go? I mean, what can it really sell if nobody's buying anything? So the theory behind a supply-side economy is they take all this capital in, they put the capital into the banks or they put it into the sovereign funds, like in Singapore, they put it into the sovereign wealth funds or Temasek or GIC, which is the nation's investment arm. Okay, Temasek invests in companies, many of which are going to wind up on the Singapore Stock Exchange. Okay, GIC invests in the infrastructure projects. Okay, so all of that money is taken from the consumer, okay, or the individual. It's put into savings, and then it finds its way into those investments. Those investments are, for the most part, externally focused. Okay, Temasek is very much about creating businesses that are externally facing. Okay, they may be into some infrastructure within the country, but the idea is to create businesses that will export or provide services to international companies that are coming into a country like Singapore. Similarly, in Japan, the Postal Savings Program was a savings program that provided money for the Japanese companies, and these Japanese companies then had access to lots and lots and lots of capital. Same thing in Korea, that the big companies could then use that capital, and they had steady capital, low-cost capital, lots of capital, to do what? To get into capital-intensive businesses. Okay? Now, in these types of economies, let me ask a question, and you think about this answer. Is inflation good or is inflation bad? Now, look, if I'm in a demand-side economy, inflation is not a bad thing. As prices begin to go up, and let's say, just one second, let's say I have a bottle of water, and I look at this bottle of water, and the bottle of water is 10 rupees. But tomorrow, this bottle of water is going to cost 12 rupees. That's inflation. What do I do today? Do you buy? Sure you do, because you know the price is going to be higher tomorrow. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that inflation in a demand-side economy keeps the consumer buying. On the other hand, if this bottle of water is 10 rupees today and tomorrow it's going to be 9, what do? I wait. I buy it tomorrow. I wake up thirsty, okay, because I know the prices are going to be lower. And if the prices are just going to be the same, there's really no impetus for me to go out and buy. So inflation is actually, in limited amounts, quite good for a demand-side economy. Unfortunately, in a supply-side economy, the higher the inflation rate is, the more the interest rates have to go up. And as interest rates go up, what happens? Investors don't invest. The theory behind the supply-side economy is that if interest rates are low, more projects become potentially profitable. Look, if my interest rate is 3%, I probably make investments when I have a return or a predicted return of 6, 7, 8, 10%. But if my interest rate is 20%, I'm probably going to need a 50, 60, 70% return before I'm willing to make an investment. There's a lot more projects that have a 6 to 8% return than a 60 to 80% return. So this is why the economies tend to be quite a bit different. Okay? Now let's kind of move forward for a second. Now, there's nothing good, there's nothing bad, there's nothing sinister or evil or virtuous about either one of these economies. They are what they are. You as business people need to just understand what type of an economy your competitor's coming from, because it'll help you to understand their strength. And it'll also help you to understand their potential weaknesses. Okay, now let's kind of take a step forward and look at where some of these supply-side economies were and when the interest rates or when the investment structure was very different in these two types of economies. Now look, demand-side economies tend to grow much faster than supply-side economies. Runaway demand is a great thing. Investors see that. They know they're going to be able to execute. They love demand-side economies. These are things that grow very, very quickly. But supply-side economies tend to be relatively stable, relatively low growth. Now, in the spring of 1982, going back a long time in history now, almost 30 years, right? In the spring of 1982, we saw very, very different economies around the world. I remember I was kind of coming out of college, starting my first job, and I was in the finance industry. And I remember in 82, 83, I remember where the interest rates were. And I remember the first day working in a finance house, I looked at where the interest rate was in the United States. And the minimum lending rate at that time, which is the rate that banks charge their very, very, very best customer. Now at that point in time, that would have been somebody like IBM. They were the bluest of the blue chips in the US. What do you think the interest rate was in the spring of 1982? Well, it peaked out, and it peaked out at 23.5%. Now, same day, same time, where was the interest rate in Mexico? Higher or lower than 23%? Higher. Okay, this is a glimpse as to where the interest rates were for some selected countries at that time. So we see the United States was about 23.5%. Okay, if I'm looking at Mexico, Mexico was at around 60%. If I look down in Brazil, Brazil's interest rate was about 480%. And if I were to look at just the inflation rate alone in Brazil, Brazil's inflation rate in 1982 was running around 140 to 160%. So nobody was even making loans in Brazil, but if we had to put an interest rate on it, we might have said it was somewhere around 480%. And Israel was close to 1,000. Now, on the same day, same time, on the other side of the world, looking at some of the supply side economies, the interest rate in Japan was about 2.5%. The interest rate for government-sponsored companies in Korea was roughly about 2.25%. And the interest rate in Singapore was about 1.9%. Okay. Wow, that's just incredible. Just incredible what a difference there is there. Okay, now, let me ask you a question. If you're sitting in the central bank of Japan, and your interest or your cost of capital for your companies is at 2.5%, and you know the Americans are at 23.5%, the Mexicans are at 60%, the Brazilians are at 500 or so. Okay, what do you do with your money? Now, I know the first thing you're going to say is, okay, put it in the American banks and get 23.5%. You can't do that because what it'll do is first of all, it'll take your interest rates in America down because now they have more funds available. So it'll lower the interest rates for the Americans. So you want to use this as a competitive advantage. And you want to compete in the world market. As we said, a supply-side economy is not about domestic consumption. It's about selling goods abroad. So we want to sell goods, and we want to sell goods abroad. We want to be in an export-based business. But what kind of export-based businesses do you want to be in now? Okay, think about what you know right now. What kind of an export-based business would you want to be in? Well, what's your advantage? Your advantage is what? It's low-cost capital, right? Your capital cost is almost 1/10 what the Americans is. So I want to be in the most capital-intensive business I can find that is an export business. Not a domestic business because then it's consumed at home. But what I want to do is export this to the US, Brazil, Mexico, and bring money back home so that I have even more money in my supply side economy, which leads to more savings, lower interest rates, more investment, et cetera, et cetera. So what I want to do here is I want to put it in the most capital intensive businesses that I can find. Now, what's one of the most capital intensive businesses? Well, usually we're looking at things like energy or metals. So what did the Japanese do? They started to invest in metal, in particular steel. Now, once upon a time, I was a steel resource fellow at Northwestern University. And, I used to look at the steel industry. And just as a rule of thumb, okay, in the steel industry, you needed about $2 to $2.50 worth of plant to produce $1 annually of steel. So if I needed to produce $1 billion of steel, I needed a $2 billion factory. Okay? So I needed $2 of equipment to produce $1 of steel. Now look, that steel plant would produce steel for 50 years, but I needed a $2 factory to produce $1 of steel every year. Okay? So what's my cost of capital in the United States? Well, look at the chart. Okay, at 23.5% interest rate, $2 worth of capital, 23.5%, that means on every $1 of steel, I have a capital cost of what? 47 cents. Okay? If I look at Brazil or Mexico, well, in Mexico, the interest rate is 60 cents, or excuse me, 60%. $2 worth of capital, that means my cost of capital or my cost of interest is about $1.20 on $1 of steel. Can I produce steel? We haven't even talked about labor, raw materials, transportation, taxes. All of that stuff hasn't even been talked about. But I know that my cost to producing of my capital cost is already higher than what I can sell it for. There's no way I can compete. If I'm looking at a place like Brazil, Israel, they're talking $10, $20 to produce $1 worth of steel. They're not in the steel business. On the other hand, over in Japan, same day, same time, with a 2.5% interest rate, their cost of capital on $1 worth of steel, if they build a new factory, is about 5 cents. If I'm looking at Singapore, it's about 3.8% or 3.8 cents. So if I'm looking at Japan versus the United States, let's say, and we look at the trade wars of the early 1980s, this is where it was. Okay, it was all based on capital. And what happened was the Japanese, with a 2.5% interest rate, went out and they started making steel at very, very, very low prices. And what's great about steel? Think about it. What's good about it? It's capital intensive, yes. It's used and consumed internationally, yes. It's an essential building block for a lot of other products, yeah. Okay, but what else is good about steel? It's a commodity. So you don't have to get over brands and, nation of origin and things like that. A commodity is a commodity. If you can hit the grade and you can hit the quality level, the only thing that matters in commodities are what? Price, 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 and price, and delivery time and lot size. So how long somebody has to wait, and when can they get it, or how much they have to buy at a time. And other than that, it's all about price. When you sell commodities, the primary way in which competition is undertaken is price-based. So if I look at the United States versus the Japanese in the early 1980s, the Japanese started to invest in steel. Now the Japanese have what? They have cheap steel, and they still have cheap capital. So what are you going to invest in next? What uses a lot of steel and a lot of capital? No, not the automobile. Ships. Because ships, there's a lot of steel in a ship. That's all a ship is made out of. So they started to dominate the world in steel and then in shipbuilding. But now you got cheap steel, you got cheap ships, which means cheap transportation, and you want to fill the back of those ships with something that uses a lot of steel and a lot of capital. And that's the automobile. And then eventually it was the consumer durables and so on and so forth. And that was the way that the Japanese began to dominate the economy of the world during that time period. It was a very simple model, okay? Low cost capital, okay? They got into steel, then they got into ships, then they got into automobiles, and that's the way they began to dominate the world. Now look, there were a lot of books being written at that time about dense packed office spacing, about collective culture, about the Japanese lifetime employment system. All of that stuff was garbage, okay? The real key to the Japanese business model was what? It was cheap capital.